Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring indigenous ecological knowledge. My guest is James Tunney, a poet, a novelist, an artist, an attorney who has lectured all over the world on international law. He is author of The Mystical Accord, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, Sutras to Suit Our Times, as well as The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism. James has also written two dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. He's based in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. I'm very happy to be with you once again.
It's great to see you, as always, my friend. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
We'll be talking about indigenous ecological knowledge, and I think a good starting point would be for you to talk about your background and your interest in this area. Our viewers by now have heard you talk about many, many different topics, and here yet again is a completely new one.
Okay, so perhaps to establish a bit of credibility or not, Jeff. Well, first, there's two interests. There's a personal and a professional interest. My personal interest is that I've always been interested in plants. I've been interested in the Celtic use of plants, the history of plants, and also the wisdom that we can learn from other cultures, from India, from Ayurveda, from Chinese traditional medicine. And we see all around the world that there's an interest in plants and trees and how to use them. And even in art, a lot of the early colours they came from plants and trees, or when they were using them in the books, they had to know where they came from. But often people look at spectacular things like ayahuasca and they forget the ordinary things around them. And take, for example, dandelion. Dandelion, or Taraxacum officinale is the Latin name. It comes from the French dent de lion, the lion's tooth, and that gives you a clue in both names that it's more than just a weed as it's regarded. And we spend a lot of money getting rid of these weeds. Although if you look back through history, dandelion has a lot of medicines in it. As the weather is changing now, I'll go out in the garden and pick some dandelions, and they're very good for your liver and for a lot of other things. So the things that are all around us, I've explored certain plants and how they can be used just as part of your normal diet. The Department of Health in America classified once dandelion as one of the top 10 nutritious green plants. But in the Celtic tradition, we can see that there's a long history of reference to plants and to trees. The oak, the yew, for example, come up again in relation to the Druids and magic. So the connection with magic is very, very strong, as it is throughout European indigenous culture in the context of natural magic. And even if we look at, you think of Simon and Garfunkel, their song, Are You Going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme. Remember me to one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine. Now, parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme have been proven to have a beneficial effect on the brain. It's very, very interesting. And if we take rosemary, for example, they've been studying rosemary in relation to a particular group of people in Italy who live near Salerno, because they live very long, the longevity is fantastic, and their brains are in good condition. And they're wondering whether the fact that they use a lot of rosemary is related to that. So it's no surprise that they might know about the power of herbs, because in the 11th century we had a great medical school in Salerno. So we see this link between herbs and medicine and health and spirituality. And of course, in the context of spirituality, people like Hildegard of Bingen wrote a great book on herbalism, and we have that tradition in Europe going back to Dioscorides and other people 2,000 years ago. And the great doctors were herbalists. A lot of the monasteries were important in preserving medical knowledge as well. So I've been interested in those things. And even in the Irish context, the link between plants, the potato famine destroyed culture in Ireland, but the idea of the land and the soil and the connection between the soil and land use and plants is very, very important. But in a professional context, the last time I talked publicly about this was a long time ago in Penn State University, and it was in the context of ethnobotany. And I had, for example, a opportunity to talk to Wade Davis and to listen to Wade Davis. Now, Wade Davis is a very interesting character, an ethnobotanist, an explorer for National Geographic, a very respected person in this domain, who coined terms such as the ethnosphere, for example. So we can think of the biosphere and the ethnosphere where people live, and also other concepts that have come in, like the technosphere, to begin to think of the interaction of these forces. Now, Wade Davis is interesting, for example, because he's studied the phenomenon of zombies, and he wrote the book The Serpent and the Rainbow, and he also was a protege of Richard Evans Schultes, who was in Harvard, and he was a great botanist who went down to the Amazon. He was there for 12 years. He saw people who had suffered as a result of, with scars from the rubber industry there, the rubber industry that Roger Casement, the great Dublin explorer of human rights, had talked about in his reports in the Amazon and in relation to Congo. So Schultes went down there to study a whole range of plants and discovered magic mushrooms down there. But of course, we have traditions of unbroken traditions of use of psilocybin in Europe, in the Celtic countries, and there's a link as well, I believe, with certain phenomenon. There's a slang name I see used for magic mushrooms called pookies, which is related to the word puka, I think, which we've discussed before, and you've discussed, of course, in your great interviews with Robert Anton Wilson before. And sometimes in Scotland, they talk about people who are not really there as being away with the fairies. So we have a little crossover there. But if we think about the fact that ethnobotanists may get credit for the origin of these things, we have to remember that it was the Native Americans in that context that discovered these uses. It was the Native Americans that had the genius in some way to put together two distinct plants in the context of ayahuasca, the shrub and the vine, and to get them to interact in a very complex way that couldn't have been easily determined in a scientific way. And even when we look at other dimensions, of course, in the context, in the spectacular end of the herbal domain in relation to, say, Huxley, and that idea of him being associated with the doors of perception and use of mescaline, of course, and the psychedelic era, as defined in a letter to Humphrey Osmond, that he was using mescaline, which of course came from peyote, and sometimes referred to as mescal, but that came on the scene really in 1891 with another Irishman called James Mooney, who had gone to and participated in a peyote ceremony with Quanah Parker, the Comanche. And the Quanah Parker said, bring these back to Washington and tell them that this is used in our religion. And he brought it back to Washington and he distributed that. And as a result of that, the plant was studied and the constituent elements was isolated in 1897 in Berlin. It was also sent to another person who sent it on to William James, who took it and was ill. But from there, as a result of studies and certain books, for example, Kluver, I think in 1928, The Divine Plant, explains how this operates as an entheogen. But again, the history goes back to the native people, and there's a tendency to give the credit in some ways to other people. And similarly, we could look at the advent or bringing back of cannabis or cannabis sativa from India. Another Irish man, actually, William Brooks O'Shaughnessy, was out there, and he presented a paper in Bengal in 1839 about the medicinal use of cannabis as it has been used traditionally in Indian culture. And he brought it back, and they began to sell it in tinctures in London from that time. It was quite common before it was banned later on by the Medical Association. So we have this great combination of things. Why I was particularly interested in it, because I taught intellectual property. And intellectual property is a battleground between traditional knowledge and contemporary knowledge. And there's a lot of struggles in relation to neem and the patentability of these subjects. Neem is a plant or a tree which has been used for medicinal purposes in India and other countries for a long period of time. And because of that interest, I began to look at where this knowledge comes from and how we were kind of obscuring the origin of a lot of contemporary medicines and issues which are referred to as bioprospecting and biopiracy. So I hope that wasn't too long, Jeff, but that's why my personal and professional interest came about.
No, you have an amazing repertoire of knowledge. I'm really blown away by how much you are able to keep in your head. But let's talk for a moment about the source of the indigenous knowledge, because my understanding is that the shamans, the native people who come up with these, as you point out, almost impossible concoctions, such as the ayahuasca brew, almost unanimously report that the plants speak to them.
That's right, yeah, and it would be very difficult to accept that for the Western mind if it wasn't for the fact that the evidence is there, that the combinatorial possibilities which explain how some of these things came about, it's difficult to comprehend, and so the evidence is there, and this is a factor which we find in mysticism, that people come up with things that they couldn't have done otherwise, or they say they can't have done. So they do say they talk to the plants. There's another way to look at it. If we look in Europe, for example, we had the doctrine of signatures, which was important for people like Jacob Boehme and others. But this goes back to a very old idea, which is there in the Judeo-Christian theology and in most theologies. And the idea is that if we have a creator, well, then everything was created for us. And if we have a problem, well, then there is a solution for it. So if we take the idea of the doctrine of signatures, and a lot of people think it's daft, but for example, the idea that you look at something and it can tell you what it's good for in medicinal context. So I remember thinking about the walnut, and the walnut, of course, it looks like a skull on the brain if you regard it from outside and then go inside. And actually it has been proven by science in recent years that there are things in walnuts which are good for your brain. So, I mean, it is a strange way. So in some senses, there is another idea that there are signs out there. Now, I know you have talked in various of your conversations and in presence about the idea that it's a kind of hide and seek out there, that the answers are there. Where the universe plays a game of hide and seek with us. I've interpreted it in a different way, in that, as I've talked about in relation to ideas of light, that we're kind of led on a path if we're only willing to follow the crumbs, if we're only willing to follow the breadcrumbs on the trail. We will get to solutions, but we have to kind of engage with things. So yes, the shaman communicate in some way, and in some way they are accessing a different realm of knowledge. And perhaps by going inwards, as all mystical traditions say, they can look in a different way. They can look in the depth, and they can therefore enter into a different zone. In the way, as in quantum physics, when we get to a particularly small level, we get into a different level of interaction that we could not have anticipated. It's not that things get smaller, they behave in a different force. So perhaps the mystical path enables us in that sense to achieve noetic inspiration, which is not available elsewhere. And that's the classic argument that mystics make.
Yeah, I probably would be inclined to think that this is evidence that the whole universe itself is conscious, which is a point of view that I don't think is recognized either in the scientific systems or in the legal systems.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. Of course, we have the Gaia Hypothesis and Lovelock and that. But yes, in this sense, that's another point that indigenous cultures believe that everything had spirits. You can look at it from an animistic perspective or a broader theological perspective, but there was a spirit in everything. And this is not is solely an ancient idea. I mean, I would make the argument up to very recently there was elements of indigenous culture surviving in Ireland. And I talked to my elderly aunt who's still alive in London, and she communicates about how she sees or how she feels the rocks talking to her. And now she's a very spiritual woman in many senses, but it wasn't strange to have this idea in Europe. Europe hasn't advanced everywhere in the way that people perceive. So there are pockets of the indigenous cultures. The same in the Basque country, there are some very old traditions that are there. So we have to be careful not to believe that we've jumped into a modern society and left everything behind so quickly.
Let's talk now about some of your activities as an attorney representing the rights of indigenous people to own the knowledge that they've obtained over centuries.
I didn't work directly in that context because I worked in the academic world, although I have worked in countries like Lesotho and Moldova, where I have dealt with some of these issues. But what I wanted to do was through the academic world to present arguments, which I have published at the top 5th star level of research in these at an international level in this dimension. So what I tried to do was to present the arguments in relation to the nature of indigenous knowledge in a way that could accord with the existing legal system. And so in that sense, and also, I did travel to Canada and stayed on a reservation for a while to begin to get a sense of what life was like in relation to in some of these contemporary manifestations and how these plants and the idea of traditional ecological or environmental knowledge is utilized and relevant still. So it was mainly in the present age in that effort. And we can see, for example, that this is very, very important. If we look at people like Vandana Shiva, for example, she is an example in the Indian context where she became aware of these issues and she led campaigns in relation to challenging the patentability of extracts from neem and in relation to turmeric as well. And she's very, very aware. She calls it biopiracy and bioprospecting. And she believes that there is a very deliberate policy from the West to extract indigenous knowledge in that sense. And she's right. So I agree with that. I think there has to be a reconciliation. Although when they won those cases, they won them under the existing law. So in some senses, the law could accommodate it by showing that actually there had been prior knowledge, that they weren't new and obvious, the requirements for patentability. But the struggle in relation to indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge and the apparatus around science, that kind of science commercial corporatist connection is very, very important. And one of the contemporary manifestations of problems in that domain now is associated with traditional farming practices in India. And she emphasizes how there have been an horrendous amount of suicides by Indian farmers in the last few years, going back to the 90s. And the figures are horrendous, up to 10,000 a year are some of the estimations, or well, the reports. And that's associated with moving away from traditional land practices which were shown by colonial investigators to be good practices, that the people knew how to farm the land. And in fact, she argues that some of the ideas in India were taken back to Europe and utilized in the organic farming idea. And we see that people like Rudolf Steiner was interested in organic farming. So these are very, very important issues, and there is a conflict between the respect and recognition of traditional ecological knowledge, which we can think in different terms from scientific knowledge in a contemporary sense. So on one hand, we have an idea that we have knowledge which is consistent with a holistic sense of the environment, which has a spiritual sense, which has community practices around it and certain rituals and procedures, and is belonged and handed down through by tradition within the community for the community's benefit. So it's less about owning in an individual context. And we have that idea and its proven success. Other examples of its success are in relation, if you look at the origin of scurvy and knowledge about treatment of scurvy, for example, we find a connection back to Native Americans and them helping sailors in Montreal a few hundred years ago. So this examples of its efficacy and the superior knowledge of Indigenous people is there. But on the Western idea, and not just the Western idea, because we would have a same in a contemporary Oriental context. We can't just confine it to the West or say it's all about white people or something like that. That's too narrow. It's about a particular methodology. So if we conceive of the core scientific paradigm as being, whether we describe as Baconian or Cartesian or Newtonian, where it's associated with an idea of a clockwork mechanism, of control, of mechanization, of industrialization, of use of machines, of the superiority of the machines, of utilizing those powers to squeeze things out of nature, to force the secrets out of nature, as Bacon might have said, the scientist. The idea that we have to torture nature to get the secrets out. It's a horrible kind of domination kind of idea, which it includes an idea of domination about people, and which creates a very, very narrow focused idea. And at the same time, it conflicts and imposes directly opposition to the traditional environmental knowledge. And as part of that process, there seems to be a need to denigrate the traditional ecological knowledge, to believe that it doesn't exist, to believe that it's superstitious, to believe that there's no sense to it, to fail to recognize its holistic sense. And in that sense, if Shiva in India can be described as an eco-feminist, I believe she's in the same tradition as, in a European context, the pagan figures of Bridget, or the Christian figures of Bridget, for example. And that idea in the eco-feminist context that goes back to the goddess figure, which has been taken out because the respect for the earth mother, or the respect for resources, the respect for water, the conceptualization of these things as deeper integrated forces, or as you have indicated, a living system, a living interactive system that can't be reduced, that can't be put under a microscope and explained. And we had a conversation with your nephew about the complexity of water and the molecular structure and how people think they know H2O, etc., but it's a lot more complex than that. And Indigenous people understood and had greater respect for some of these things. It's self-evident, but we've lost some of that self-evident awareness. And if we want to solve some of the problems, we need to have respect and enlarge our own interaction with nature and not be taken away from it.
I understand that the very term ecology suggests that everything is interconnected. And I know when I first was an undergraduate in college, the word ecology was hardly ever spoken. It was biology, and we were thinking then of the separation of species, and everything is different than everything else. But ecology as a Western science, because I don't think that it's an indigenous term. I think it is a Western scientific term, but it does suggest an entirely different way of perceiving the world.
Well, the benefit of the Western scientific approach is that it works because it classifies everything, going back to Linnaeus, we established a taxonomy. And it was him that came up with names like cannabis sativa, for example, in relation to the hemp plant, which is a crucial plant. And then you classify, then you begin to break down, and then you begin to isolate and concentrate on and find things that work, usually with the help of getting information from what has worked already. And then you say, oh, look what science has done, even though, for example, you've got a lot of hints. But when you continue to break things down, you fail then to see the interrelationship between things. So, for example, there will be a difference when people begin to take some of these. I know there's a lot of studies in relation to psilocybin and some very, very interesting possibilities from there. But when we begin to concentrate the active ingredient as seen by chemists and focus on one particular issue, we fail to see that there may be two other active ingredients who operate in that context, whose interrelationship is crucial for the way it interacts with the human body or brain. And there's a failure sometimes because of the identification and reductive approach to see that interrelationship. And sometimes things are more complex than immediate results will lead us to. So that idea of extraction, exploitation, explanation, being the particular genius of that method, has limitations where we're dealing with complex phenomena that interact between things. And then when we're dealing with living phenomenon, and then when we have to consider quantum effects and that, and when they don't understand what consciousness is. So the great scientific method that has no idea what consciousness is, that has taken away the idea of the spirit, which is what is the crucial idea in traditional ecological knowledge, and they haven't successfully replaced it yet, then want us to believe that they have all the answers through their method, whereas they may be leaving out the most important thing, consciousness, the overarching idea of human consciousness, animal consciousness, and the consciousness of the universe. If we go back to the Vedas and the Upanishads and that wider interactive idea, or the Tao, as C.S. Lewis talked about.
Many years ago, I interviewed Fritjof Capra, who is the author of a book called The Tao of Physics, a very famous book. And then after that, he set up an organization called, if I remember correctly, the Elmwood Institute. And even though he himself was a theoretical physicist, he argued that we should stop thinking of physics as being the bedrock of science, that actually, in his view, it should be biology. And I think by that he meant ecology, that if we understand that everything is interconnected with everything else, then we can base our foundation of knowledge upon that.
Well, yeah, the Tao of Physics would have been a book that was very influential for me and similar books in that context. So when you look at people like that bring an enlightened idea, and Rupert Sheldrake, of course, is another great example in that context. But what he's doing, it seems to me, is seeking to take an integrated, holistic approach, which allows for and has respect for biological function, but integrates it into a wider context, utilizing scientific method, but in a corresponding way, accepting the spiritual dimension to it, and therefore he is able and open to see it in a better way. So we don't have that exclusivity and the idea of the exclusivity of the scientific method, which is a characteristic of scientism, which is bad science and can lead to pseudoscience and bad results, for example. And so certain biologists have an insight, and they should have an insight. Or marine biologists, we can see that if that idea going back to Steinbeck and Ed Rickards and those books about looking at the animals and plants around, the log from the sea or Cortez, and to look at the things around in order to understand the universe. And when one begins to have respect for the environment, for the creatures around, for the complexity, for one's own ignorance about these things, to have a degree of humility. And then when one begins to look at the range of indigenous traditions, and the perennial philosophy, of course, is critical in this, we begin, or if we look to Taoism, of course, they observe nature very much, and water, and the observing of how water behaved was critical for a lot of their ideas. And the reason why these things work and we can extract messages from them is because there's a certain truth from the behavior, because we're made of the same things. So yes, I agree with that stream. And I'd also put Wade Davis in there as well. And there's other people I see in the context of mycology. I see Paul Stamets and other people that are talking about the significance of mushrooms, and how, and referring to the example of mushrooms to clean up pollution, and how other examples of where we have fungus growing in Chernobyl that can consume radiation, that offer great opportunities for us to find environmental solutions. Although there's a line, I think, and when I think about Terence McKenna, and he was another great explorer, and Wade Davis was down in the Amazon at the time Terence McKenna went down there. So I'm open to all those ideas, that the use of medicinal plants in a properly regulated context for people that are mature enough and in appropriate conditions to engage in that is good. But he put all his eggs in one basket. He seemed to believe that the mushroom would solve everything. And I think that that's a wrong approach. And it's even wrong in terms of traditional knowledge, because they suggest the need to have the holistic. You have to look at things holistically. So there's different emphasis that we can get. Wade Davis seems to have a greater holistic sense. He's very, very aware of the significance and the need to respecting diversity in relation to cultural practices and different peoples, which is important. So we have to come imbued with these knowledge or these values, and in particular, not to come with the arrogance that was behind anthropology in its early stages and in some contemporary context, where in many ways these were imperial servants who were going out to understand how the empire could exploit resources. I mean, that's really a lot of the history of some of these subjects. And even today, there is even that thread in relation to, or that nexus between the state, even the military-industrial complex, and the study of consciousness that we can see. And John Lilly, for example, who made great contributions, was in that milieu. So there is an overlap there as well. So, but yes, those biologists can certainly contribute, because they have that humility and they have some recognition that we are spiritual beings, which I think is the most important.
I do hear from viewers occasionally who are very concerned about the progress that we're making in areas like the scientific study of shamanism and consciousness, because they're concerned that we still live in an industrial society, that even though there are these very important fringe scientists making progress, that ultimately their fear is that whatever progress is made, let's say remote viewing as an example, it will end up coming into the service of a militaristic industrial culture, and that would be a bad thing.
I share that fear, Jeff. I share that fear to a large extent. And it's very, very interesting. Not totally, but I mean, I think there are solutions, but one must be careful because we want balance here. So if you think the term psychedelic was used in a letter from Osmond to Huxley in 1957. So we have the term psychedelic coming into popular use. We also had the term artificial intelligence coming in through John McCarthy and in those discussions we talked about before. And also the other Huxley, Julian Huxley, in 1957 defined the term transhumanism. So it's quite remarkable that in 1956 to 1957 we had this, like the fruit body of a mycelium that's underneath perhaps, which suggests a link between some of the things we've talked about in the transhumanist video and some of the evolution in relation to psychedelics. Now remember, if we think about Huxley writes the perennial philosophy, apparently to me as a combating the kind of imperial view, the scientific view that he knew from London, and he that was combating that strand for him. And he writes Brave New World, and we have drugs being used in that Soma, You Brave New World. And then, of course, he has the island. In the island, they set up the paradise, but it fails in the end. And Huxley warned that these things could be used to enslave us. And also, in Heaven and Hell, he kind of dismisses, after he has his experiences with mescaline and that, he then says, well, that this is not a shortcut, the best method of obtaining mystical experience, and he seems to dismiss all the other practices which come to it in a way. I think he is a bit dismissive in that essay. And I think that's a mistake. But one has to remember about Huxley, that Huxley was unable to, as he said himself, to engage the inner eye. He had difficulty with hypnagogic imagery. And so there are certain people that need or to have their eyes opened by other means. But it's a mistake then to believe that process or that mystical event is the spiritual event or its spiritual evolution. I think there's a conflation there. So one has to be careful in that sense. And there is a certain concern that if we have a medicalization of the hallucinogenic, the entheogenics, the drugs that can invoke an experience of God, that they will be perfect tools to maintain that servitude, to make us fall in love with our servitude. When we're locked up at home in the human zoo, that we can take these drugs and feel happy that we're wider. And McKenna wrote an essay about psychedelics in the age of the intelligent machines. And him and Timothy Leary seem to be very, very open towards the new age of technology, as I am myself, but they were embracing it in a way, for me, which suggested an opening to transhumanism. The idea that, well, if our minds can escape from all this, well, then this technology is merely another way to get into some psychedelic, novel environment. And in that, for me, they're engaging in a mental exercise and not a spiritual exercise. So I think one has to be careful. I have respect for the people who have associations with the indigenous people in North America and South America and elsewhere, who have connections with them and who follow and have respect for their use, and who understand, or some of the people who are licensed shaman in various places in the United States, for example, where they can perform and use herbal medicines, but they're doing it in a respectful way. That's a different game than buying over the counter or getting your shot as part of an idea to pacify you. So there is a tension there that we have to be careful about. And I think Terence McKenna probably recognized in some of his interviews that he overestimated the power of the 60s revolution, and he didn't. The 70s kind of reaction to it showed that they hadn't moved so far in many senses.
Now, you spent some time living on an Indian reservation in Canada. If I recall correctly, it was a Cree reservation. What did you learn there from living with these people?
I only went out for a short time because I had done a few lectures in Canada, and I was meeting the native people, and I always felt an affinity in that sense, because the struggle in Ireland over a few hundred years mirrors the struggle that Indigenous people had in the United States. So my disposition was always to understand, and I had particular interest or particular affinities which arose in relation to, say, the Lakota Sioux, and very interested in figures like Red Cloud and their prophecies of the seventh generation and the recurrent. But I stayed with the Ojibwe, or the Chippewa people. Only for a short time. I went back to stay on a reservation to get a sense of, with a friend I had made, to get a sense of what the experience was like. And it was, there's a lot of difficulties, a lot of socioeconomic difficulties because of genuine embedded discrimination. And now this is controversial because people in Canada say, no, that's not true. But if you look at the structural context, there's a lot of difficulties, and there still are difficulties. But it was a great experience for me. From the first time I gave some talks over there, I realized that the Native American people have a profound sense of lived spirituality in a contemporary sense. It's not historic. It's very, very real. When I arrived up for the first time, I was giving a talk. Someone said, I had a dream about you last night. They never met me. And, I believe them. And other people were telling me about their dreams, and they were telling me about various things about how they saw the world. And so it is a real heritage that they have preserved, not just for them, but for us. So in relation to, there's a film called Thunderheart, which is based on the Pine Ridge reservation, and that was recommended to me by one of the Native Americans. And you can see some of the same issues, the socioeconomic issues and the difficulties. But the point that emerged from me was, despite those socioeconomic issues, their spiritual richness is very, very deep. Their knowledge of the environment is very, very deep. Now, the prophecies from various Native American leaders are that there would be an efflorescence of the Native American people about now, if you like. That's my interpretation. So they anticipated that it would take a while to recover, and there is evidence of an efflorescence of Indigenous people who operate in both worlds. And we see that in Australia as well. And there have been some significant legal cases, like the Mabo case, which I've written about in Australia, which is a revolutionary legal decision. And most people won't know about that. But it really changed and had great significance for Indigenous people. So what I learned was humility, respect for their culture. It's going to be difficult, but I'm meant to go to Pine Ridge to meet the Lakota Sioux, as you know, in the summer, and I'm learning a lot in relation to what they're doing and their hopes. And I think the Sioux in particular are doing some very interesting things, and we see again interests in issues such as hemp and the use of industrial hemp, and the exploration of how these plants can be used in a contemporary context. And of course, when we're talking about these issues, we also have to remember the coca leaf in South America, and the way that the extract from the coca leaf, although that's used for medicinal purposes and has a little bad effects, when it's taken in an industrial context, it can be used as a tool for control, and it has defined the criminal justice system, or some of these drugs, in the United States, and the criminalization through that technocratic system of plants which in their original form, if they're taken in their original form, don't have the same nasty consequences that in an industrialized productive context happen. And the same thing if we look at the poppy. Again, the poppy, which is traditional medicine uses, of course, was behind the opium wars with Britain and China, and great international struggles over a plant which, if utilized in a traditional context, could provide benefits that are different. So again, that's part of not just the scientific method or the scientism, but the interaction of ideas of corporatism and ideas of superiority, which make a mess of certain gifts to us, and which, if we have a context of decriminalization and sensible use of these things, they can be reintegrated perhaps, or approached in a different way. And it's terrible. There's so many people in prison for possession of small amounts of drugs. I mean, that's the thing that history is not going to be kind on people for, or on generations for, how they have punished people for possession of small amounts of these substances.
Well, I know I've been to Peru where coca tea, based on the coca leaf, is the national drink. You can drink coca tea. It's offered usually for free in every hotel lobby. And I know the native Quechua Indians of Peru chew on the coca leaf. It helps them to live in the very high altitudes of the Andes Mountains and to climb long distances. It's quite safe for them there, whereas crack cocaine in the U.S. is abused terribly. But it seems to me that if there is an efflorescence, as you say, of indigenous culture, that we've got to come to terms with what has in the United States, I remember back in the 1960s, was called the Trail of Broken Treaties, because in the United States, and I suspect even in Canada and in South America, every time a treaty was made with indigenous peoples, it was broken. And hundreds of times over the decades, over the centuries. And this is an injustice that has survived for so long. I would think as a lawyer, it's overwhelming how one can even begin to correct the enormous abuses of indigenous people that have occurred over the centuries.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. I mean, there's... For example, there's the Leonard. I did a painting recently in relation to Leonard Peltier, who's been in prison for a long time, and there's a lot of international discontent about that and anger. And there are certain examples that could be used where by his freedom, for example, that would send out messages. But apart from that, we can do it on a simpler level. For example, the Native American church utilized peyote, and that was going back to the experience of Quanah Parker and the Comanches and James Mooney that we talked about, 1891, around that period, which corresponded also with the ghost dance phase, and Mooney had looked at that. There's an interesting relationship there. But they say, for example, I think in 2019, the Native Americans said that they don't want peyote to be descheduled because it would affect them. The supply of it is under pressure already. So I think in examples like that simple example, we should say immediately yes, and we respect that, and we're not going to treat it in the same way, whatever other responses. So there are very, very simple things in relation to the production of hemp, and there has been a long struggle in relation to that. We should facilitate the desires of what are supposedly independent peoples and not treat them like children in that context. So there are little things that we can do to respect those traditions, to try and start off, and listening is a key. So we have to listen in relation to what what they think is the optimum thing, and to have great respect for that. And when we do begin to listen, we can begin to then work on the bigger issues. We can begin to hear what the issues are and to begin to work on them. Now, this is in our own interest. So from the Western perspective, it's in the interest of the West, because their conception is superior conception in relation to the environment. It's closer to the earth. In many ways, people look to the great civilizations of Egypt, for example, the pyramids, etc. But we're talking about a very dominant imperial slave society, which its spirituality developed into a kind of, as Manly Hall talked about, a kind of black magic at the top in certain senses, which moved away from the more perennial Hermetic philosophy, which I think is the philosophy which is more consistent with the perennial philosophy around the world. And in some ways, there will be, or there has to be, a movement away from that high-octane, consumerist, mechanized idea. And in that sense, we have to refer to, with respect, and learn from people who also have their religions. It's the same in Africa. We don't talk about religions in Africa, but there are native religions in Africa. There's no other way to describe them. Africa is forgotten about in this context. And even in the same, in the context of voodoo and that, people have cinematic ideas of what it is, and they don't respect that there are deep theological ideas behind these things. So it behoves us to look at the different cultures with respect, because our culture is on the wrong road in relation to its monocultural, monotechnical approach in the sense that we talked about in relation to Lewis Mumford. So the idea that we have different perspectives, that we can learn different ways, that we can utilize nature as well to help us solve the problems, that we can bring in the best, for example, mycologists, whatever, that are respectful, like Stamets, for example, who understand these things or have respect for people like Capra and Sheldrake and others who can give us a wider idea and integrate a wider idea of spirituality into the picture. I think that will be useful for us too. But listening to the needs and working from there, and forgetting about. Now, one thing I will say, that I think it's a mistake for advocates of the Native Americans to have a unified view of everyone outside the things, because, for example, coming from an Irish context, if I look at the place where my mother was born, it was a pile of rocks really with a thatched roof. It was medieval in many senses. So they came from a situation of colonization as well. So they weren't the colonizers in that sense. So there are more shared interests. I would argue that there's greater shared interests than people imagine. And this is a time where we can create those bridges of meaning where people can mutually learn with respect and with humility and without judgment, and that the institutions that have been destructive, or the elements in the institutions of not Christianity as a theology, but the way Christianity was utilized in certain contexts with instruments of power, with imperial structures of power, that we can reapproach those things, look at them again with an open heart and an open mind. The same as I think that if we take James Mooney, he seemed to have a sympathetic view, and he also was interested. His father had come from Ireland in the famine. He was very involved in the struggle in Ireland for land reform. Again, same issue as we have in relation to India, and very aware. And in fact, I believe that when Douglas Hyde came to America, he came to the White House, he brought along with him Seamus O'Mwaney, who was James Mooney, with him, because they had a connection. So there are shared interests that we have to cultivate with respect and with dignity, and without condemning people on both sides, because that doesn't help. We have to look to the future, derive the knowledge, derive the inspiration from the people that are there, and listen and have respect for the contemporary manifestations of the traditions.
Well, interestingly, today is March 1st when we're recording this conversation, and today I released a video interview with Jürgen Kramer. He is the co-author of a book called Ethno-Autobiography, and he makes an interesting point that many Westerners, instead of going to Indian reservations to understand shamanism there, if we look at our own traditions, if we go back far enough, we all come from indigenous cultures. And he recommends that we find the indigenous culture in our own background.
There's a big problem here, Jeff, and this is from an Irish context. If I look at the time of grandparents and I look at the census, you see that they're all bilingual, for example. They had Irish. If I go back, my father's generation, my uncle, they were great lovers of the Irish language. And my uncle in particular, he was a politician, but he was a teacher and into drama and that, but he had a great love of the Irish language. And he was explaining to me certain idioms and certain words and concepts that never came into English, very unusual, that see the world in a different way. And in there are certain ideas that are more oblique, they're less direct. The Swedish Germanic languages, for example, are very direct. But in this in this language, an ancient language, we have a fantastic amount of poetry that was only really rediscovered in the 19th century because it hadn't been available. The people spoke it, and within that there was a great degree of myths and that. And that's what people like Yeats and Russell were tapping into, and that was part of what was called the Celtic Twilight, the late 19th century, and that began to feed back into a broader English-speaking culture. But it was there, and in that there are great stories. There are stories about how, for example, the fiddle players took the tunes from the air. They heard the tunes, the fairy tunes on the air, how they may have got tunes from the whales, but through upturned boats, how they were more involved with the environment, how they had a great idea of the other world. And it's all in the languages. And all these things that people think came up in California about UFOs and shape shifting and this, that and the other, we can see it in the ancient culture. It's all there. Now, the problem is that's being destroyed. It's disappearing in my view. It's disappearing because there has been an idea that all that stuff is superstition. All that thing is not really part of the modern age, despite whatever claims are made for it, as a living, real force. It's very much demoralized, and an awful lot is going to be lost. There are cultures, Wade Davis makes this point, are languages being lost every day now because of this lack of diversity and lack of cultural diversity. And there's also a problem in relation to the urban intelligentsia, that there has been a very strong tradition. We can see this in both the left and the right of a kind of hatred of the countryside, that everything in the countryside, we see it in Irish literature, was kind of backward. They were always complaining about things. They were, and that's also part of that materialist paradigm that underpins certain strength, both on the neoliberal strand and the corporate strand, and also we can see it in Trotsky and in Marx as well, that there was or Lenin, and we can see the attitudes in relation to people on the land. So there is this, because it was seen to be, the optimum was an urban working culture with machines, which is part of their machine mentality. So there are deep forces. I believe that it will be very, very difficult to preserve, both in Ireland and in Scotland, because it's a very similar. I can understand Scots Gaelic, not fantastically, but it's a very close language, and there's great wisdom even in Scots English as Scots dialect. It's a beautiful language that's dying out. It really is beautiful when you look at some of the terms, and there's a great diversity which is being lost. So I see myself as an indigenous person in some senses, because I had access to the culture that was there. I have respect for that tradition. I picked up elements of it from the Irish culture. My family, as far as I can see, were in that space for thousands of years. But now the idea is that now I'm all in favour of I'm cosmopolitan. It's not an argument about not having different groups or whatever, but it's an idea of respecting people that have been in a particular place. Now, I've talked to some of my younger friends here who are some more left-wing or anarchists, whatever, who say, but we can't have a connection between blood and soil because they associate that with the narrative of Nazi Germany and all that. But it's a mistake. We can't respect indigenous people if we don't understand that connection with the soil and with land is very, very important, because they treat it as a living being. They understand how it works. And if you look at some of the solutions, there are very interesting books being written about soil and about how we can use soil in a more productive way to capture carbon and things like that, to utilize in a way which will solve some of the problems, which can solve some of the problems very, very quickly. And what I fear is that the scientists are going to take control of the solutions. And what the scientists, for me, who are not the respectful scientists, who don't have the holistic view, they're like gamblers at a casino in Monte Carlo who will say, oh, we'll have another bet, another spin of the wheel, and we'll win this one. So they'll deny their influence in creating the conditions that led to the destruction of the environment. And then they'll say, well, let's have this solution. Now we can control the weather. I read about they're trying this in China. Well, that doesn't seem like a great solution to me, or a great idea. They don't care about how much junk is put up in the sky. And we will have technocratic solutions based on technocratic analysis where they don't have necessarily a great sense of the interaction. I'd like to see a greater and wiser involvement of native peoples in that, and a greater respect for solutions that are ecological, and a greater use of nature in a sensitive way to solve some of these problems, as opposed to saying that it's a problem that we can solve by more science, by more quantitative methods, by more machines, by more nanotechnology, by more problems that create a problem elsewhere. So.
Well, that's very eloquently put. When you talk about dead languages and dead cultures, I'm reminded of Carl Jung's explorations into the what he called the collective unconscious, which he thought of as the world of the dead. It's as if these things never really die. They still exist within us. And ultimately, in order to address the imbalances in our culture, it seems we have to go within. We have to find those parts of our own soul that we have lost, because they're still there, deeply buried within our own consciousness.
They certainly are. And as you have emphasized, Jeff, many times, is that we're all inheritors of these cultures. It doesn't mean that we go in and rob their traditional plants, but it means that we have access, if we want to listen to the wisdom, to the ideas. And what different languages can do is to provide us with different perspectives, to look a bit differently, to approach it in a different in a different way. And but there is no question, unfortunately, that if we don't have a greater awareness of the need to have biological diversity and diversity within the ethnosphere among people, to respect the diversity, to have a cosmopolitan approach, not to be so condemnatory, to celebrate other people's culture and our own culture, wherever that is, and also not to treat one culture as different, not to say that, well, you're a privileged culture in the past, although they wouldn't have recognised that as privileged in Ireland if you told them they were privileged, Jeff, when I talked to the people and what they went through in the west of Ireland, and surviving famine and that, and, 1 million people killed, and Mayo was the worst place for deaths in the west of Ireland, with emigration, whatever. They wouldn't have regarded it as a very privileged position, or what happened afterwards with the various wars of independence, etc. We're not going into that, but the point is that every people has something, has suffered something, has experienced something, have done damage to other people. But we're at a point where we have to transcend those things. And we transcend things by not abandoning everything, by looking again, by reinterpreting, by moving on, by allowing them to live in different contexts, by having respect for things which are different, by not standardizing everything. Standardization is a killer in many senses. Once we fail to see that diversity and complexity of a living system, we lose a lot. And there's something in the modern manifestations of the scientific method, and again, it's not about science, but it's about the application, combined with the corporatist approach and the materialist philosophy behind that, without any recognition and with disrespect for religion or spirituality, which will lead to disastrous results. There's no question. In my view, it cannot lead to good results. It might be okay if you have resolved, like Bernal talked about, to leave the planet, as a lot of people talking about, as they seem to be, to say, well, it's a lost cause, so it doesn't matter what we do. But that makes me suspicious about how much they really want to solve the problems that need to be solved.
Well, James Tunney, once again, a very stimulating, brilliant conversation. I know we, as always, just seem to be scratching the surface, but hopefully we'll come back to this topic again and again in the future because there's always so much more to say. It's been a joy to be with you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. And the last point, I was talking about plants, because of course, when we're talking about plants, a lot of spiritual traditions, esoteric traditions are based on the tree of life. For example, the tree is always there. Conceptions, even scientific perspectives, mapping, they have trees, and although that may misrepresent things. And I was thinking about your roots of consciousness, Jeff, and how innovative that was in its time, and how you anticipated the central issue of our time. And I'm hoping that through your work now, that and gathering your ideas and benefiting from your reflections on the PK man and those forces and all the people that you've talked about, that what we're going to get from you is the efflorescence of consciousness, the development of your perspective, which draws together your perceptions, which builds on your work, and which will be useful for humanity going forward. And I think I look forward to see you. I hope you are able to, or get the chance to draw them together for the benefit of us, because I think it will be very, very useful.
Well, thank you, James. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.